How's it been, Grant here? Welcome back to another camera comparison video. This time I've got the brand new iPhone 12 up against the iPhone 12 Pro. And so both these phones share the same front-facing selfie camera as well as the same upgraded rear wide-angle camera with the wider aperture, meaning it lets in more light for better low-light performance on both these phones. The real differences come in with the iPhone 12 Pro having the telephoto lens, meaning you get to zoom in 2 times optically versus the 2 times digital zoom on the iPhone 12. The 12 Pro also has that LiDAR sensor, which is helping with depth sensing, presumably for better portrait shots. And you're actually limited to 30 frames per second with your HDR recording video on the iPhone 12, where you can shoot up to 60 frames per second HDR video on the 12 Pro, if any of that really means anything to you. So both these phones seem very similar, even in cameras, and so I'm going to take a bunch of photos and videos and show them to you in both good and low light conditions, so you can decide for yourself which of these two phones are going to be best for your camera needs. And so maybe you're wondering how much better is the 12 Pro performing with that telephoto lens and LiDAR sensor, or can I save some money and go with the 12 Pro if the difference isn't really that big? So take a look at the photos and videos, come back at the end, and I'll let you know what I have to think, but also leave a comment down below with what you think about how each of these phones are performing. So let's take a look at those photos and videos. Hey everyone, so here's a video test from the rear cameras on the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. This is at 1080p, 30 frames per second. And we're starting out with the ultra wide angle cameras here so you can see how wide that field of view is on both. I can pan around here to the right and then back to the left just to see what that panning looks like on this lens. And what's nice is that you can actually switch between the lenses here while recording. So main lens on both phones there. See what that looks like. And we'll pan over to the right and do the usual zoom test on that cell tower. So we'll get about 2 times zoom there on the iPhone 12 and 2 times telephoto on the 12 Pro. So see what digital on the 12 looks like compared to the optical zoom on the 12 Pro. See if you can spot any difference. I don't see the big deal about telephoto lenses if they're only going to give you 2 times optical. I don't see a big difference between the digital personally. And it only really affects when you get to farther zoom, and on the 12 you can only zoom up to 3 times. And on the 12 Pro, actually let's back that out to the same 3 times zoom there on each. But the 12 Pro can go all the way up to 6 times zoom. So that's how they would compare there. And I'll back up to the main lens here. Again, 1 time. And we'll test autofocus on the post, so the regular 12 first. So autofocus and refocusing speeds are as fast as you would expect. Same with the 12 Pro here. So really quick again, focus and refocus with some decent background blur there. And so we'll test some stabilization as I walk down the stairs here. So they should be pretty good here on both at 1080p. And this also lets you kind of see the colors of the park with that greenery there. And one last pan around to see how it handles the changing light and up into that sun right there. Okay, and we're back with the same test, this time at 4K, 30 frames per second on each phone. Also starting out with the ultra wide angle lens on both. And again, I can pan over to the right and pan over to the left so you can see that panning in ultra wide. And also pay attention to the colors. Usually Apple's really good about keeping the same colors between the different lenses there. So I'll even switch between the lenses. That's the main wide on the Pro and main wide on the 12. And as I pan up, you'll see it adjust for that exposure for the sky there. So it's nice deep blue again. And if we pan over to the right, we can test our zoom again here at 4K. So again, pinch to zoom 2 times here on the regular 12 and tap for 2 times telephoto on the 12 Pro. And again, the regular 12 has a max 3 times digital zoom. We'll try to pinch to zoom into 3 times to compare on the Pro. And a full 6 times digital zoom there on the Pro, still at 4K. So we'll back it out to the main lens here, and we'll do some autofocus tests on the post with the regular 12 first. So still looking really good and really fast here on the focus and refocus on the iPhone 12. And now on the Pro, same thing, really fast autofocus, refocus, and with a decent background blur there. And so let's test stabilization. Going down the stairs in 4K. This should still be good at 4K, I would imagine, here on both phones. Apple usually has really nice stabilization all the way up to 4K 60. And we'll pan around again so you can see how the exposure and everything handles into that afternoon sunlight. Hey everyone, so here's a quick front-facing test on the cameras on the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. This is both at 1080p 30 frames per second to start out with here, and I can pan around so you can kind of see how the exposure handles into the changing light. And the afternoon sun's behind me, as you can see right there, so we can see what that looks like on the video. And I can pan back around and we'll start walking to test the stabilization here from the front-facing cameras, which still should be very good. Apple really has traditionally great stabilization at all resolutions on both the front and rear cameras. But let me know what you see. How does this look? And how does everything sound here at 1080p? Hey everyone, so here's the same test from the front-facing cameras, this time at 4K 60 frames per second. So that's the max resolution and frame rate from the front-facing cameras. I really want to test this out so you can kind of see the difference between at 30 frames, although it's going to be hard because I'm exporting this out at 30 frames, but maybe you'll see a difference. But at least if anything, you'll see if the colors are any different or anything else. The afternoon sun again back there. And we can also test the stabilization at 60 frames, which should still be very good here as it was on the last generation of iPhone. But again, we'll test it out and we'll see for ourselves. So let me know what you think. How does this compare to that 1080p footage that you just saw? And hopefully this helps you out and check out the differences here on the front-facing cameras on both of these iPhones.
I got that heat, let's go.
Hey everyone, so here is some low light footage on the iPhone 12 and the iPhone 12 Pro. This is at 1080p, 30 frames per second, and we're starting with the ultra wide angle lens here. So I'll pan over this way so you kind of see how wide that field of view is on each phone there. And what's nice is I can actually switch to the main lens here while recording. And then I can pinch to zoom 2 times digitally on the regular iPhone 12 and tap to go to the telephoto 2 times zoom on the 12 Pro. So you can compare the telephoto lens to the digital zoom between the Pro and the regular 12. And I can pinch to zoom in 3 times max on the regular 12. And let's get to 3 times here on the Pro, so you can compare what that looks like. And then you go all the way to 6 times zoom on the 12 Pro. So I'll back out to the main lens on each. And I'll pan over this way. And we'll start walking, so you can kind of see how the stabilization works on each of these phones, as well as how it handles the changing lighting conditions. So that was a pretty well lit area there. And as you round around the corner, it's going to transition into a much darker area. So you can see how the camera handles that darker scene. And from what I can see in the viewfinder, it's brightening up the area pretty well on both phones here. But of course, we'll see what it looks like once it's processed and off the phones. Pan up into the night sky, which is actually pretty dark, but looks a bit bright and noisy, at least in the viewfinders. And I'll pan over here to where there's a little bit more light, so you can compare what that looks like here. So there's a quick clip in low light, 1080p on both phones. Hey everyone, so here's the same test here, same scene, this time at 4K on both phones. And this is 4K 30. They can both shoot 4K 60, but I wouldn't recommend 60 frames per second in low light, as it's going to be even darker than what you're seeing right here. But hopefully you can compare this back to the 1080p footage you just saw and see what that looks like from 4K to 1080. So there's the main lens, 2 times pinch to zoom on the 12, and tap for 2 times telephoto on the Pro. Full 3 times digital zoom there on the regular 12. Pinch to zoom, do the same 3 times on the Pro, and then a full 6 times digital zoom there on the 12 Pro. So we'll zoom back out to the main camera on each. And again, I'll pan around and we'll start walking to test. Again, stabilization here at 4K this time. And there's a pretty good breeze here, so this should be testing the audio as well to see how well it's able to focus on my voice versus that decent breeze going on right now. And let's see if 4K looks any darker than 1080p did in this much darker area. The viewfinders seem to be brightening up the scene pretty similarly to what I saw in 1080p, but again, we'll see what the video looks like once processed. And again, point up into the night sky. And one more time over here to a little bit more light. So there's 4K low light on the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. Hey everyone, so here's a bit of a low light test from the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. This is 1080p 30 frames per second, and they both can shoot up to 4K 60. I don't recommend shooting 60 frames per second in low light, like I said, because it tends to be darker than even what you're seeing here. Now, of course, I've got a bunch of lights around me, so this is a good test to see if you see any kind of lens flaring or anything and how it's just handling that bright light. pan up to see the light contrasting with that dark sky to see if it's overexposing the sky or not. And we'll just walk over here so we can test stabilization from the front-facing cameras. And I'll be walking over to a darker area so you can kind of see how it changes into that light and how these cameras hold up. Also, if you see any kind of jittering around or not as it gets darker here. And I've also got a fountain going, so that'll be a good test for the audio as well to see how that fountain noise competes with the sound of my voice. And it's a bit darker in this area, so let's see how both of these cameras are doing here. And I'll pan around. There'll be a lot of bright lights behind me, so we can see how these really intense lights are looking in the front-facing cameras there. Not too much lens flaring in the viewfinder, which is pretty good because those are really bright lights. And I'll pan back around this way. And we'll end it here in a bit of this darker area. So a quick low light test in 1080p from the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro. Hey everyone, so here's the same test here, this time at 4K 60 frames per second. So I thought I'd just do 60 frames to show you what that looks like. It should look a little bit darker here actually. And again, we'll just do the same test. You can see the lights behind me and we'll walk so you can actually see what the 60 frames per second stabilization looks like here in a bit more low light. We'll walk by the same fountain so you'll be able to see it in darker conditions as well. But it is pretty good that the iPhone can shoot 4K 60 stabilized on the front-facing camera. I think this is a good test in low light. It's getting a lot darker, at least in the viewfinder. It might look different once processed. But this is probably the darkest point here. And again, the viewfinder, they both look pretty dark. But it could look a little bit brighter once the video is processed. We'll see. And I'll pan around here again. You can see the really bright street lights behind me. And pan around this way. And if in case you're wanting about 4K 30 frames per second, that pretty much looks, as far as brightness, just like the 1080p footage did. So I thought I'd just show you the 60 frames per second at 4K footage so you can kind of see if you want to use this in low light or not. But there you go, 4K 60 from the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro in some low light. Hey everyone, so I thought I'd close out this video with some footage from the front-facing cameras indoors here. This is at 4K 30 frames per second, as well as giving my thoughts about how I thought the iPhone 12 and the 12 Pro performed here. And so like you thought, pretty much having the same front-facing and main rear cameras, photos and videos from those cameras pretty much look the same to me. There are slight differences in some of the photos, but that's just accounted for because they're different photos, taking that a few seconds apart, and there could be slight variables that make them look a little bit different. But through the majority of the photos that I took with the rear-facing main wide camera and the front-facing cameras, photos and videos pretty much look the same to me, which you would expect. The real difference is also where you'd expect in the telephoto lens that the 12 Pro has that the regular 12 doesn't. If you look at 2x zoomed in shots taken with the 12 Pro, you'll notice some differences against the 2x digital shots from the regular 12. For example, the wooden wheel photo that I took, you'll see they clearly look different, but they still look pretty good at first glance. It's only when you zoom in can you tell that the 12 Pro has a bit more detail. But because it's only 2x zoom, I'm not sure what real utility that's going to have. It's going to be really limited. And I don't think a lot of people are going to be pixel peeping like that. But if you did, you could tell that the 12 Pro had a bit more detail. In other occasions, it's a lot harder to actually tell, like the shot of the flower. That's not perfect lighting conditions, and both shots looked fairly similar even when zooming in. And so the telephoto didn't really have that much of a advantage in that particular shot. And in other shots where it's less than ideal light and you have some shadows in the photo even, like in the shot of the building where there's a lot of bright blue skies behind it, and the building in the front of the building is a lot more shadowy, you'll notice that the shot with the telephoto lens on the iPhone 12 Pro is a little bit darker than the shot on the regular 12. And that's because the telephoto lens on the 12 Pro has a narrower aperture, meaning it takes in less light, and so it's going to be a little bit darker than the regular 12, which just crops in on the main sensor, which has a wider aperture and lets in more light. So in some situations, the telephoto lens is going to be beneficial, but because it's only 2x zoom, its utility is going to be pretty limited. And overall, if that's going to be the only difference, at least from what I see between these two phone cameras, then I would suggest you save a few bucks and you just go with the regular 12, because unless you're going to be zooming in a lot, because the 12 Pro also has a more zoom. It has twice the digital zoom at 10x versus 5x digital on the regular 12. So unless you're planning to zoom in a lot with your phones and take photos and videos, and even then it's not really that much of a zoom, I would get the regular 12. Save some money because every other aspect of these two phones is pretty much the same. Same size, same processor, slightly different build materials, but the regular 12 still is built very solidly. So again, if you're not going to be zooming in a lot, I would recommend you save a little bit of money and go with the regular iPhone 12 or the 12 Pro. To me, the lines are a lot more blurred this year, and I think the regular 12 is almost every bit pro as the iPhone 12 Pro is. So again, that's just my opinion, but I would like to hear what you have to think. So leave a comment down below. Let me know if you saw any other differences that I'm not pointing out here. If you've got the 12 or the 12 Pro, which one, which color? Let's continue our conversation down in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.